listening to Sable Radio.
Okay. Hello, my name is Leon Davis, also known as LUSCIOUS, and today I am leading a conversation with two people who have influenced me a lot in kind of my creative practice, as they have worked in kind of inclusive club spaces in terms of the art and design and the production of the events. And I wanted to kind of talk to them today about the fact that queer rave art really isn't something that is celebrated or exhibited or discussed anywhere near as much as rave art is. We all kind of love it. We see it constantly referenced and talked about. So I kind of wanted to give this platform to talk to two people who have had kind of a huge part in their respective queer rave scenes. And the first person that we're talking to today is Susie Mason. Hi, Susie.
Hi.
Would you like to maybe introduce yourself a little bit, what you do, and your kind of history in queer club spaces?
Okay, so I'm Susie Mason, and I'm from Leeds. I grew up here, and I started going clubbing when I was about 14, 15 years old, and didn't really think too much about it, and just accepted the situation that how the club culture was back in those days in the 80s. We did have the warehouse and the phonographique where you could go if you were alternative. Alternative being anything to do with kind of music, gender, sexuality, just an artist. It wasn't really defined. It was just not ordinary. And then I went to live in London for a while. I went to Goldsmiths, and when I came back, there'd been a really quite serious recession, in the country in the 80s, and half of Leeds was boarded up, and there was really nowhere to go out, and it was really quite depressing, and I just used to create these parties at home in the flat, and I used to go out raving, so all the big raves in Leeds, down at what was Leeds Polytechnic at the time, and and I loved them, and I loved raving, and I was out all the time, but it got to a point where there's just really big impersonal spaces, and they weren't creative, and they weren't visually creative, and me being a visual artist, I just felt like there was something really lacking, and so I started going to gay clubs, and but the gay clubs were really predominantly designed for men. And they were male spaces that you were welcome into, just to sit kind of on the sidelines. You weren't catered for as a woman,
right?
And so there just wasn't that space that felt like you could be, that was more kind of female as well, and more open and more creative, where there was this mix of people, everything, there wasn't that space where I just felt that I belonged.
Yeah.
And so we created initially what was an art club, and we just worked with local artists, and we had lots of art on the walls, and it was really for artists and musicians, and it took off really quickly, and it became so popular that we had to start to police the door, and we started to get lots of people wanting to cause trouble because it was glamorous, and that's when I kind of realised there was something really important to do in Leeds, and I could affect change. And,
wow.
And one night a boy came in that was obviously gay, and the doorman just literally had a knee-jerk homophobic response and just punched him in the face and broke his nose, and that was in 1992, and that was okay in Leeds at that time. That was normal. That was, like, to put it into context of how it was, as a girl, you would just go out and you'd expect to get, boys to just touch you up, and you'd expect to have violent attacks if you were gay. It was just how Leeds was quite dangerous, and it was racist, and so we just wanted to create this kind of, kick against that and make our home city better. And when that happened to that boy, and I had a massive argument with the doorman, and the owner of the club wanted the doorman sacked, he didn't understand. He just didn't understand.
Because it was so normalised.
He just didn't get it. And so we kind of, that sent us off into, we decided to leave and find another venue and set our stall out and be really clear about what we were going to, what we believed in and what we thought Leeds needed, and the people of Leeds. So we started a club called Vague, which was like a kind of pun on Vogue, but it was like, if you can see like the first flyers here. you know, and it was like on Vogue, because it was very fashion, but it was about being vague, you know, sexually vague, just that you could actually go into a space and explore your identity and transform your identity and find out who you were, and you didn't have to be, you know, maybe who you were brought up as.
Yeah.
You know, you didn't necessarily know who you were or what you could become. So, you know, and we were really, really, really strict about it, and we were political, and we had so many rules, do you know what I mean, that people had to follow. And we had this as well, we had a statement of intent that people had to sign before they could come into the club. And it just became so successful.
I mean, this statement of intent is kind of like a lot of the safe space agreements that you see in clubs today.
But it was unheard of back then. And we were doing everything on instinct because we didn't, you know.
Could you maybe read some of this to the audience?
I mean, this is also the language of the time as well, but it says, vague statement of intent. I undersigned hereby declare that I understand that this form exists in order to protect all patrons of Vague from potential abuse. I have no problem with any person who is or appears to be gay or of any sexual orientation that may be different to my own, etc., etc. And then it says at the end, I promise to respect my brothers and sisters, hang loose and have a real good time, or failing that, go home and not bother anyone. Vague wishes you a great evening and thank you for your cooperation.
Wow.
And everything we did was very serious, but we also did it with humour. And that was through the visuals were all very light, very colourful. The club itself was very light, very colourful. And the reason for that is because, you know, we were artists, but I think that I understood that if you go into what was normally clubs were really dark, that they're dangerous.
Yeah.
Dark spaces are dangerous for people. And,
that's so true.
So we painted the club white and turquoise and pink, and they let us. And we put all the lights up, and at first people were quite confused, but it just meant that everybody could interact with each other because there weren't, you know, and everybody felt safe. And then we kind of wanted to create this cartoon world almost, so that when people came in, they naturally didn't feel aggressive or threatened, or, you know, so, you know, that whole idea that the space actually affects your behaviour. I mean, I do really believe that. So
Same here.
And it seemed to work, and people liked it. So not everybody liked it. Some people were like really offended by it.
But the right people liked it, I assume.
Yeah. And we made the artwork provocative. We didn't make the artwork, say, provocative to attract kind of, you know, like, you know, queer culture people, gay people, or women. We kind of made the artwork to kind of, we came from the other angle, that we made it provocative so that people would not want to come.
Yeah.
You know, the people that we didn't want to would, you know, we made sure we wrote the word gay on everything, because back in the 90s it would be still like quite a big word to say, so we made sure we wrote it on everything, and then people go, oh, I don't want to go there.
You wanted to like scare away the people that were going to be uncomfortable and were going to cause trouble.
Yeah, I mean, so it wasn't really that we kind of sought to attract people, because people just kind of came to us, and we didn't advertise.
So there must have been like a huge demand for this kind of a space for you to not even have to really put the word out there.
There was very few places to go out in Leeds then, so there wasn't loads of choice. I mean, you know, there was Back to Basics, which was the other main club, like big player. But so Leeds was on the map, and people came. They travelled from all over. You know, they'd bus in from Hull, from Newcastle. They'd come from London. They'd come from, you know, overseas.
Wow.
You know, Leeds was really kind of known for, you know, it's been a kind of a centre for clubbing. And some people move between the two and things like that. So, but what was really important for me is that I wanted lots of people to come in that we could educate as well. So the reason why we were deliberately mixed and open is that, you know, from my experience as well, you might be questioning your sexuality when you're young. You might not be. You might be sure. You might be unsure. But the fact that you had to separate because, you know, one person would be gay but maybe wanted to go out with his brother or sister or his friends and they weren't, and that idea that you had to separate socially was really upsetting, and I'd experienced that with my friends, and so it was more that people wanted to be together because they were of the same mindset, and that wasn't necessarily your sexuality. So it could be all sorts of reasons why you connect with people. So it was really important that we had that space where people could be whatever they wanted to be, and then also people that maybe wanted to come out, that were safe, because it wasn't a really intimidating kind of all-gay space, which can be really intimidating. It could have been. It was really intimidating.
I agree.
Back in those days. So you had that kind of fluidity to just go, you know, to play really on a Saturday night and say, and dress up and just explore your identity and allow it to kind of grow and evolve without it being restricted. You know, which it is when you're growing up naturally through school and family. It kind of gets kind of put into a, you know,
constantly you're always being told that, you know, the way that you are is not normal, and this is what normal is, and it can beat people down and make them so unsure and scared of being their true selves. So that's why, you know, spaces like the ones that you've created, to be able to allow people to have that freedom and not feel they have to fit into a specific box, can be so healthy and so good for society.
I think the word normal needs to be removed from the English language now.
True, because, I mean, what even is normal? It's just what...
I'd see it as quite a derogatory term, actually, if I was called normal. So I wouldn't, I think, you know, things are obviously kind of getting better, and, you know, but on the same school. And then we kind of ran that club for 3 years, and then, you know, we had lots of upsets and fallouts, and it was very hedonistic. It was really highly charged, you know what I mean? So, and then I kind of moved on and ended up running SpeedQueen with a woman that I'd met at the club. And we grew that into a social enterprise. And that was really, really about building community, because we had the audience, we had the customers, but we really wanted to build a really strong kind of permanent community for Leeds. And that was before there was a business format of social enterprise. So, you know, we were just kind of giving our money away. You know? We were just working with charities all the time and investing in people and sponsoring young people to go to college. And we were doing all that. And my accountant would be like, why are you doing that? And I was like, there must be a format. There wasn't a business format for, you know, an ethical business in those days. So it was actually really difficult because nobody understood what we were doing, and we didn't understand what we were doing. We just knew that that's what we wanted to do. That was brave of you to kind of go about that and pioneer that, despite having no inclination of how to do it, you know? Yeah, so it was, you know, and then from that, we got approached by the SFOR, which is the Stabilisation Force for NATO, and they'd heard about the work we were doing just from reading the press and things that we'd had written about integration. And there was a man in the British Army out in Bosnia who was working to try and integrate the youth after what had been a really horrific war in 1992, like, you know, ethnic cleansing, and asked if we would go out to run some club nights in Bosnia to try and integrate young people through dance music, because I mean, even the British Army had an understanding that dance music and parties like could really challenge people and move things forward. And I get constantly upset how people really dismiss clubbing as being superficial to this day, because it really can be the most creative, challenging, political, you know, active space that affects young people and affects their life decisions and their attitudes. 100%. And such a spiritual space as well, and a space in where so many kind of barriers can be let down within a sense of self and a sense of ego, and within these ideas of, you know, these categories and boxes we put ourselves in that you're talking about. So yeah, I completely agree that it's a shame that so many people do see it as such a superficial thing, and especially that governments and councils don't really value nightlife spaces anymore, or ever really have done, and that just seems to get worse and worse. I think, you know, it's really important that, for me, I feel that I've got to a stage where I could actually start to document some of this in a more kind of, with some gravitas almost, to give, you know, so that the local councils and people to start to actually understand the huge value of these spaces, so that it gives a kind of a springboard for younger people to go and create it without always having to say, but this is really important, this has real value, and everybody just goes, you know, like when I was working, people didn't get it. So hopefully that will happen.
Yeah.
So, and when we went out to Bosnia, it was life-changing, really, because we'd created this club for Leeds, and it was purpose-built for Leeds. It was very hedonistic. It was, you know, there was
It must have been a
sex
huge...
and drugs and rock and roll. And, you know, we went out there and they asked us if we'd work with children, because they said children had never, ever had a school disco, never had a party, never met anybody from outside Bosnia. So we ran club nights, and we did the club nights, and they deliberately kind of promoted it to get the Serbians, the Croatians and the Muslim teenagers predominantly together.
Because they were all the different warring factions
and
at the time.
Were all, and obviously there'd been the Serbs and the Croatians against the Muslims, so it was a really big deal what they were trying to do. And we ended up with 3,000 people in these club nights, and some of them had walked 25 miles to get there. And I think they charged about 50 pence, the equivalent 50, which still for people was a lot of money. But all the money that we took on the door, we gave to a lady that was working as a one-woman charity to work with the kids that had been put into refugee camp, orphanages and care homes where the disabled kids were, because they were all rejected. There was lots of awful stigmas in Bosnia and around children. And so we worked with them for 5 years until the army pulled out, and and it was dangerous. There were landmines everywhere. We had to be escorted everywhere with the army. But to take what we created for Leeds and put it in a completely different culture with different age groups, and some of these camps, children had just grown up in them. They were makeshift, and it still worked.
Why do you think that is, and how did you manage to translate, this club in Leeds to the middle of nowhere in Bosnia? Well, it's crazy.
I was scratching my head about that for quite a long time. I was like, I don't understand why it works. But ultimately, I think it's just because we were just really authentic, and ultimately, what else is there in life except to want to be together and, for people to have fun, to have parties, to listen to music, to dance, to feel safe, and those young people were saying to us they couldn't believe we were there because they'd not had parties, they'd not had magazines, they'd not had fashion, all the stuff that we took for granted growing up, they hadn't had any access to. So I think it was just that understanding that those are kind of universal needs, and and all the team that we took, there were 15 of us, all just completely got behind it. And so we did percussion workshops, circus workshops, anything that people wanted, we just kind of delivered. And,
wow.
And I think it just worked because it was real. And I think the people were really, really grateful, to have that connection with the outside world. And so a lot of our DJs went out there quite a few times, sent a lot of music out there. I used to do a lot of projects because I used to work in a fashion department at the uni and get all my students to run upcycling projects and send all the fashion out there. And
that's great.
It was just this it could have put a lot of things into perspective as well, because you can moan about your life, however good it is, can't you? But when you kind of see how the reality of, however we think life is here in Leeds, and still to this day there's things that could always be better. Like now, there are people all over the world having a really hard time. Mm-hmm. So there's always work to be done. It doesn't really have to just be here. Yeah,
people don't realise that, and I don't think that work is ever gonna really
I remember, back in the 90s, if somebody had said to me that gay marriage would be legal, I would have just said, that will not happen in my lifetime. I just couldn't imagine that ever being it was a concept that was outside of my understanding. Mm-hmm. And to see the changes that have happened in society for the better have just been like, wow. And to feel that you've been part of that in some way, kind of pushing things forward. And I got to a point where I thought, we don't really need to exist anymore because our job's done and everybody's free and open, everybody loves everybody, and you can be gay and you can walk down the street and you're not going to get your head kicked in. But actually, that's not true. And I think if people don't no, it's not true. And sometimes I think things are sometimes worse.
Yeah.
And
I see what you mean.
what I've come to understand after all 30 years, really, since I started doing this work, is that if people don't constantly keep pushing forward, like collectively, from every different angle and every different walk of life, then it's almost like the reset button happens, and
Yeah.
so that you can never ever take your foot off the pedal. I mean, and it's got to be lots of people doing it in lots of different places, because even if we're, like I said before, even if we're all right here, what about the people in other countries where they're still getting murdered, basically? So, it's so it is like a life's work, really.
It's easy for people to become complacent when they're having a good time and not realise that can be at the expense of so many others and so many others' comfortableness, especially in club spaces. Cis straight men that are having a great time might not realise how uncomfortable their actions or their behaviours are making other queer people or women around them, and that's something that they could be just completely oblivious of. And that's why, like you say, and I think that's still a problem today. You talked about dark club spaces, and you talked about the women and the queer people feeling unsafe in those spaces. I think that from my own experiences and experience of my friends, that's still something that many people feel today in club spaces, despite like you say, the advancements that have happened. So many of these attitudes and so many of these dangers are still very present.
Yeah, definitely. And we used to talk to boys all the time in the club. I mean, sometimes, because you could never tell who was gay and who was straight in SpeedQueen ever, and boys, straight boys would have their bums pinched, and they'd come and they'd complain to me, because everybody had the right to complain to us about anything, and we would always deal with it if anybody felt. And I'd be like, but this is what I've had to deal with all my life, get over it. This is what you've probably done to girls all your life. And they'd be like, oh, yeah, I didn't think about it like that. So, but it's funny, but it's something as simple as that.
It's not actually funny.
But that kind of a really simple conversation like that can actually flip somebody, and it can actually challenge their thinking a little bit, and they can go, oh, yeah, actually, I don't have to behave like that. And it's got to be that at all, because you can't bully people into kind of changing their behaviour. You've got to explain to them, I find, why they've got to, behave a bit more respectfully. And then when they get it, it's like, you just think, well, they won't pass that on then. Yeah.
And I mean, in kind of like facilitating this philosophy and this sense of inclusivity in education, I understand that you used art and creativity a lot to kind of do that, not just within your flyers, but within the kind of like the space itself. Maybe you could kind of run us through the ways in which creativity ended up playing a large part in all your different events.
Well, we dressed the club, and it took us a whole day. We'd start at 9 o'clock in the morning every single Saturday. Wow. And we'd have a team. We had a team of people that would work for us, rigging.
Are there pictures of the club in here?
Yeah. And then also lots of people that didn't have any money, they could come and they could help. And you can see here like all the decor we had made, and we literally transformed it. It was almost like theatre, and we transformed it all, and it would take all day. We had loads. These were all light boxes. And then that whole sense of excitement of like people would come in and throughout the day, and people could come and play on the decks, and they could come in and they could see the setup and what was going to happen. Yeah. And then we'd have the party, and then Sunday or Monday we'd take everything down, take it all away. And we did that every single week, like year in, year out. You know what I mean? But it just made the most massive difference. And we did a lot of themed parties, so we had this huge kind of like lock-up full of decor that we just built up from every different themed party, and then we just mishmash it all together, so it didn't necessarily make sense.
But it seemed like it was successful.
But everybody got involved, like the
about.
People that made the decor. We had lots of art students would come and paint scenery for us, essentially,
wow.
And people would make costumes, and so there was a space for everybody to have a creative input. It wasn't just our vision. When we had the overall vision of how we wanted it to be, as in how we wanted people to feel, but anybody could come to us and say, can I make this, or can I do this, or can I put my art up, kind of make clothes, and because we had a little boutique as well for quite a few years in town.
Oh, really?
Yeah, we had a little boutique, and it was we didn't have any gender in it. We just had clothes, so we didn't separate anything, and people would come in and be really quite confused because they'd be like, we just would try it on, and if it fits. And we sold lots of stuff for trans people. We had like shoes in much larger sizes. We sold makeup, for boys. Lots of things that people weren't doing then. Well, certainly weren't doing in Leeds.
Well, I don't think people are even doing that necessarily now. Do you know of any boutiques like that?
And that shop doesn't exist now. And we had it,
which is crazy because I feel like it's something that's very, very needed.
And I mean, I know you can buy online. This is pre-internet.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing about all the flyers as well is that there was no way of promoting anything you did except through the flyer. The flyer was like, it was, the value of it was so high because, there was like no social media, that you couldn't share. People didn't have cameras, unless you were a photographer. There was no mobile phones or anything. It sounds crazy because I'm not that old, but, it's just, the only way you could kind of let people know what was happening was by this kind of piece of paper.
Yeah.
And word of mouth, and that's how everything was promoted. And you didn't necessarily know what was going on in other cities and around, and except from word of mouth. I mean, obviously you knew what was going on in Manchester because it was near. So these were really, really important, and you strategically put them in, the boutiques you wanted, or the hairdressers, or, cafes, or anywhere where you wanted to kind of let people know. Stand out in the street and hand them out to people that looked like you wanted them to come to the club. So,
and what do you think made an effective, like, club flyer? What do you think it was in your club flyers that particularly stood out or made people really kind of excited for an event? Like, is there any examples that you have here that you remember went down really well, or that people really loved?
Well, people loved flyers back then, so people would collect them. So people wouldn't kind of reject flyers because there weren't that many things going on. Yeah. Everybody wanted the flyers. You'd stand outside the club and flyer to let people know, like, say, this is what was happening for the next 6 weeks for DJs and things. And, every single flyer would be taken. They wouldn't all be left on the floor or anything. So, I mean, imagery that would just make people think, I mean, obviously they had to give information. I was saying DJs, price, times, location. But other than that, just imagery that would just, tell. I mean, sometimes it was just because I loved pugs, and so they would go on. Random things that didn't fit. Do you know what I mean? But or ones like this that just had a really, really clear message, because we did this Valentine's ball, and I always think Valentine's Day is like a really tricky time because it's really for straight couples, and if you're not a straight couple and if you're single, it's actually not a very nice time, and certainly not then.
No.
So we always did a really big party for everybody. And then here you've got the different denominations of what everybody can be, so it's just inclusive, so it's just love for everybody rather than just that couple thing that Valentine's Day was.
Yeah, but it's great that you found ways to show that through your flyer, through visual communication, being able to say, like, this is for everyone without having to write it down.
And like this one was our first birthday, so it's Vagar 1, but it was also, we did it for World AIDS Day, and because we used to do a lot of promotion for safe sex, because again this was the early 90s and the whole HIV kind of explosion. So we were very, very kind of active there, and kind of we had Mesmac used to come in, and we was educating people because there was a lot of fear then, and so that was also the solidarity. So everything that we did kind of had a kind of a clear message, and then there was flyers like this that were just. We had a membership, and you had to give you a photograph, so we had a little card to get in, and we vetted everybody. Nobody could become a member without having like a little interview in the club.
That's brilliant.
And I think that's one thing about clubbing back then, is because there was nothing, online, you had to turn up at the door, and you had to get through, whoever was working on the door, which was Jojo at the time.
Yeah.
And you had to get into the club. I think there were so many stages to it, to being able to get in. and a lot of it was how you looked as well, as well as your attitude. So I think now that you can buy tickets to events online and it's quite remote, it's a completely different kind of experience from actually everything was done face to face and everything was done, kind of in that kind of way between people that.
And do you think that worked better?
I think it was easier to create a very intimate space,
right,
because you had to come face to face with everybody before you'd even got through the door. And so I don't know. I mean, it's different, isn't it? So yeah, I think so, because the same people would come every week, but you couldn't. There was nothing kind of remote about it. You had to talk to people and you had to interface with people. So yeah, I think probably I would think it was better, because
Yeah, I get where you're coming from. And in terms of kind of like the flyers, and what would you say maybe some of like the main themes that kept kind of like coming up are in terms of like how you went about designing the flyers? And were there any themes across like that era as a whole, and like the other queer clubs that of your time that kind of like that you seem to recur?
I think people used to kind of, everything, as you can see from these, was like kind of collaged and just collecting images and kind of subverting images. I think that was like, that kind of culture. And I think so much of the art was about new technology. So, computer graphics, they were new. I mean, this is the first example of ever using Photoshop.
Wow.
I mean, and I don't think anybody had Photoshop in Leeds, and apart from, Paul that designed these flyers, and he had a little Mac, and it was the most like, we were kind of just couldn't believe what you could do on it.
What year was this in?
92, 93.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So I think the kind of technology kind of changed flyer design. You can see it all, like with the, the rave scene starting with computer graphics. And before that, a lot of things were really word of mouth. I mean, because they didn't really use outside promoters before that. A venue would have its different nights, and you'd know which was rock night or which was the gay night or which was a student night. And you'd just go to the night that was right for you, and people just knew, because there wasn't so many places to go out. So people kind of did a lot more word of mouth. And a lot of gay clubs were in back rooms and hidden away or downstairs. And I think the dance scene really liberated a lot of people. And I think, that was because of the music, ecstasy, everything. Kind of people suddenly could just come together. And I think wasn't just the work that we were doing. It was the zeitgeist. It was what was happening kind of, across the country, really, that people just felt more free. Because of the music.
Yeah. And within that, though, I mean, everything you spoke about so far today, it sounds like you were so effective at doing what you kind of set out to. What were the kind of like challenges? What were the biggest challenges that you faced when creating these events?
So, two things. I mean, really, being female, there were no women working in clubs. Like, it was... And I was really not taken seriously. And it was kind of a challenge throughout the whole time I was working, especially by club owners. A lot of the owners started to be owned by kind of, limited companies, and, you'd get like the bosses coming down from London in the suits. And, there was a lot of, that was very difficult. And a lot of the work that we did was about redressing that balance. I mean, we were very proactive in giving opportunities to women. Certainly DJs, because it was really hard to break through as a female DJ. And just working in the club, so on the door, running it, and and it was a challenge. And all my kind of contemporaries, my peers that were working in the club scene, they were all men, and it was always like really hard to kind of. It was a bit like, oh well, you're just a girl, so you're doing like things that are bright coloured and poppy, or camp, or it was never had that. It just never seemed to be taken seriously outside the kind of customers that came and understood it, and it was difficult. But I think it was successful because it had such a female presence, and it was gentle for that reason as well.
Yeah.
And it was quite a boys' club back then, and And then the other thing is when we started Vague with its really clear politics of, integrating people together, one of the big club promoter from Manchester told me, you can't do it. You cannot put people together in Leeds. You cannot put black people, white people, straight people, gay people. You can't do it. It won't work. There will be bloodshed. Leeds is not open enough. And
you did it anyways.
I was just like, well, I want it, and I'm from Leeds, so I just think everybody else will want it.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of knew. And there was a lot of hostility. There was a lot of people who didn't understand it. There were fights. In the early days, there was a lot of fights, and we had to get so strict on the door, and we had to get all our doormen on side, because doormen in those days as well were they didn't understand what Vague was. They were confused by it, and they'd always been able to just beat people up if they wanted to. And it sounds crazy now, but, it wasn't really regulated. So once we'd got them on board, and it was actually policed, and we told every member that they had the right to have anybody thrown out of the club that disrespected them. And then people started to get it. But in the beginning, they did start, elbows were out, and it was like, it's my space, no, it's my space. And, what percentage of people are gay, and what percentage of people are straight, and what percentage of people are white. And it was, the whole point of everything that we were doing was that's not actually meant to matter.
Yeah.
It's just about being a, good human, isn't it?
Yeah.
So it did take people. It didn't just happen, and it was all partying and colour and fun. There was a lot of serious work going on behind the scenes that I didn't want people to see. I just wanted them to come in to be able to enjoy themselves. So, we did all that work kind of behind the scenes to make that happen, really.
Wow. And in terms of kind of so SpeedQueen, I feel like has quite a specific visual style over the other ones, but I'd be interested in kind of finding out what influenced each of the kind of individual identities that you gave the clubs that you ran.
Well, I think it was, the first club was very retro and vintage, and it was kind of probably, the first club, the Kit Kat Club, was probably it was vintage and retro and based on my kind of love of 1950s movies and Vague.
Do you have any examples of the Kit Kat Club fires? Yeah, it's fine.
Shall we?
Yeah, go on.
So, like these ones, and but I think it was just a natural progression. Vague was, we started it based on taking the kind of reference from the, Vogue magazine, and it kind of was quite fashion-y as well. And then SpeedQueen was, I think it became more and more and more cartoony, as it became more and more female, and SpeedQueen was run solely by women. So, and it was, it was more of a collective. It was much more of a community, kind of, like I said, social enterprise. So I think I don't think we really thought about it. I think it was just a natural kind of evolution, a bit like, kind of you change your hairstyle and your clothes as things kind of move. And I think
it grew with your own sense of identity.
I think so. I think we kind of, we kind of pushed the kind of visuals more at SpeedQueen. We put lots of kind of positive affirmations up, and lots of words we started to use in SpeedQueen, which we hadn't used before. So we had a big sign made that said homo, hetero, lesbo, and a massive neon one. And people, sometimes they'd come in and they'd just say, I want my money back. So they'd see it in the doorway and say, I want my money back. They were frightened of it. And I think frightened of words that were bright yellow and pink. It's that. So we kind of played a bit with kind of seeing how far we could push it with people as well.
I love that, and I think that's clearly worked well to filter out, like I said earlier.
I do remember that, actually. And once this girl was really distressed, and I said, I don't understand. It's a piece of plastic. It's on the wall. It's pink and orange and yellow. What is actually upsetting you? do you see what I mean? So, but it, obviously, that's what art is, isn't it? It's not a piece of plastic that's pink and yellow. It was, it's everything that it makes you feel. So, and we were really aware of that, and that's why we covered every little bit of wall space that we could, so that everywhere you looked, whatever you were doing, in whatever state you were in, you would see something. And then at SpeedQueen as well, we created this logo of this goddess,
Yeah, I think.
which I think is in there somewhere.
Yeah.
I think she's might be a bit further back. She is in there somewhere, like praying, and that was also like an incredibly incongruous image that didn't go with the nightclub. But she was there as our protector. She was there as like this kind of feminine image of protection to kind of look over us. And there's quite a few people that have got her tattooed on them now.
And up in the top right, that's the SpeedQueen like typeface as well, right?
Yeah.
And what was the inspiration behind that?
It just wanted a really kind of a logo that looked like it was moving, like from racing or something like that, because we had places to go, and it was just that, and we had that logo, and then we had some silver platform shoes and some little dolls that I put in them as I built it onto I don't have that flyer, but it was on a racing track, and it was just like as though we were just like moving, I think.
Moving forward in in society, in inclusivity, or just you had to, what do you mean by moving?
I don't think I would have kind of thought about it like that. I just would have liked the idea of it being moving, as in it was like dynamic. Mm-hmm. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
it was dynamic, and it was, and we were kind of on a journey. Mm-hmm. So I didn't want anything really kind of I wanted something really clean and blocky, that would be strong and would kind of, you could put your stamp on everything. And also we had stamps for hands, and I knew from print that things have got to be kind of, you've got to be able to transfer them to lots of different things, haven't you? Badges, T-shirts, all sorts of stuff.
Yeah.
And so it was that as well. It was like a strong kind of stamp that everybody would recognise.
Yeah, it's simple, bold, but with enough kind of like personal touch to be recognisable as you guys.
Yeah, and you could change the colours on it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was a very effective logo. I was obviously meant to also talk to Raver Jinn and play a video of that.
Have we gone over?
Should we cut to Bosnia?
Yeah.
And we can work out.
Yeah, that's good. So we have a clip of a little bit of, Suzy spoke to us earlier about her time in Bosnia, working out with the war-torn communities there, and we can actually show you a little clip of what went down. I think, was it like the first time you ever did one?
2002.
In 2002,
2002, yeah.
Yeah, I just I'd cut a little section from the actual.
Fabulous, no, I don't know, extra. The DJ was excellent. I'm so excited. It's something special for me, and I feel excellent.
Thank you very much. You guys are fucking brilliant.
Talking about glamour all the way, we've got to go home and sleep in a tent. It's called Harmonica. Mr. Techno.
It's 4 a.m. and time to hit the road. But the manager has other ideas. He wants them to play on. It seems he's now a fan of funky house.
We've got to take down, we've got another gig to go to, we've got a long drive. I know, you might how long it's taken us to drive here?
But the punters aren't moving on either. And with some encouragement from Bev, Andy fires up another tune.
Don't hesitate. Slip it on. The crowd are hungry. What's it?
It seems Kaz is outnumbered.
So got away with that one.
But this really will be the last track, as Kaz has the last laugh.
Okay, so we're back, and I hope you enjoyed that little taster of SpeedQueen and all that it had to offer. I certainly wish that I'd been able to go, but I think I was like 4. So in terms of kind of like, you know, club spaces are hopefully on the verge of opening again, and hopefully the pandemic's been a meditative time for a lot of people and a lot of promoters. What do you hope to kind of see going forward and in the future of club spaces that you haven't kind of seen already or didn't see back when you were kind of running these events?
I don't think it's a question of like what I haven't seen or what I'd like to see. I think, for me, you know, COVID has it's made everybody realise how much we actually do need to physically be together and, you know, in a space and, you know, physically. So I think I've done a lot of work in the city, so it's not really kind of my place, and I'm not working as a kind of a regular promoter anymore. So I would obviously like to see people coming back together and feeling safe. Do you know what I mean? But I think just like your generation, like the next generation, like kind of, because Leeds is so different, you know, it is a really big cosmopolitan city, and it wasn't in the 80s, you know what I mean? It was quite a hardcore working class town that went through an industrial town that went through a serious recession. And all of the industry, you know, like textiles and stuff, it just disappeared. So, you know, that left like that huge impact, and all of that's been regenerated. All those mills have been regenerated. So, you know, I'm just really fascinated to see, you know, what's going to happen, like from your generation, and who's going to kind of, you know, take on the baton and create these new spaces, because there's so much more diversity in Leeds now. But like we said before, that job is never going to be finished.
No.
I mean, for me personally, I've always wanted to see more girls working in clubs, and, you know, I still see a lot of kind of imbalance there, and I still see some of the, you know, the more ordinary straight venues, you know, they're still kind of, you know, they've got, you know, it's still kind of that whole idea of girls can just be in clubs if they've got fluffy bras on, and, you know, and they're just kind of very much objectified, and it's so I don't really know what, you know, what the future holds or anything, but I think there's huge amounts of scope for people to kind of put their own stamp on this city as well and create something new, because there hasn't been anything new for a long time, really. You know, a year's a long time to. I mean, obviously, lots of things will just go back to how they were, but that's not really interesting, is it?
No.
It's like how people want to kind of communicate after this.
And what about? I mean, like you said, you know, you kind of feel like it's time to hand the baton down to the younger generations. But what about your generation? What do you feel like your generation needs, and where to kind of, and yeah, where and how do your generation feel now without those? Specifically your queer generation, without those kind of spaces now? Well,
I think that's a very interesting question, and it's something that I'm pondering at the moment, because we had this kind of this exceptional time of, you know, in the 90s, like, you know, it was just, everything was new. Nobody had heard that music before, you know, nobody had had those experiences before. So, you know, everybody, you know, people still talk so much about it was the best time of their life, or they had these like really kind of experiences, and they made friends and relationships that are still with them today, me included. You know, it's like, you know, so the idea of just not being able to go clubbing anymore because you know you're older it's actually quite, it makes you feel quite sad.
Yeah, I'd be gutted.
You know, we are kind of like thinking about how that works at the moment. It doesn't feel very possible because of COVID, and you know, by the nature of this illness, this disease, you know, older people are more vulnerable.
Yeah.
And some of our customers are in their 60s now, and you know, so it's older even. So, you know, we had a really broad age range in the club, you know, from teenagers right through to people in the 50s and 60s. You know, when we were working weekly, that was what was wonderful about it. It was so intergenerational. For me personally, I mean, I'm about to embark on a new project where I am going to collect in and document orally all of the stories of people. So I'm going to collect in individual stories recorded of as many people as want to be part of the project to create this big collective memory of this time, you know, in the context of growing up in Leeds or arriving in Leeds in the 80s.
Sounds brilliant.
And 90s, and then from that to reconnect people, and so that we can start to create new creative projects and maybe spaces. Maybe not a full-on weekly kind of club night, but you know, certainly kind of social spaces, you know, that we could then kind of set up, and from that to build a foundation where we can support people to kind of access that kind of, I suppose,
community.
That community, and it's not just young people, because you made a really kind of valid point that my generation, it's like, where are we all going to go when we're older? Because you know, the provision for older people isn't kind of it isn't there, because you know, my generation haven't really lived through, you know, the people before us haven't made those spaces. So yeah, that might be something that I've got to kind of take on board in my 60s, you know, because it's just, you know, you need to kind of, there's a lot of work to be done for like older people that have led kind of alternative, like non-mainstream lives as well, and you know, and where are we all going to end up? I don't know. So yeah, there's a project there, isn't there?
Definitely.
A SpeedQueen residential home. You know, where we can all live.
I would love to come and visit that. That sounds great.
Yes, you can come and DJ for us.
Oh my God, yes.
Yeah, no, I'm joking, but it probably is actually something that, you know, my generation
and there's
need to really kind of think about where we're going to belong as older people.
Yeah.
And still be able to have that kind of access to that kind of diverse set of people, and visual and cultural stimulation and all the things that you need to, you know, stay well.
No, I think it's something that people clearly don't think about, and especially within queer communities as well. I mean, you know, there's not those kind of communities for the older generations in general, but for queer older generations who might have different kind of like needs and different kind of, you know, need different things to feel comfortable in these spaces. There's not really as much of them as you expect, but I think I have read about some sort of LGBT plus like retirement community that's being formed in Manchester. So to suggest that there are inklings of these kind of things starting to...
Yeah, and in Brighton as well.
Oh, brilliant.
Yeah, there are, definitely. So, yeah, so we could do that, and we could design all the rooms, and, you know, could have all of those wonderful graphics and interior design and everything just moved into kind of a different kind of social space. Because, you know, a lot of ways the nightclub, that's what you want to do when you're young. But it was a vehicle, you know, it was a vehicle for our, you know, our ideals and our dreams, really. So it could be a different vehicle.
Well, I really, really hope that you manage to kind of pull something together, and that there is a SpeedQueen residential home of some sorts. But I think, is that all we've got time for? Yeah, so honestly, thank you so much for talking to us about this, Susie. I hope that everyone's been able to learn a little bit more about Leeds queer history and just queer history in general, and to see, you know, the amazing art that was coming out of these spaces that no one's talking about this, and it annoys me.
But you can.
But I will.
You can talk about it, because there's never enough people talking about art.
No. And now we're going to speak to, well, this is a pre-recorded interview with Raver Jinn, kind of exploring the present of the queer club scene, particularly in New York, to kind of juxtapose with the Leeds and UK kind of conversation we've had here. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoy and find out even more. Hello, my name is Leon Davis, also known as LUSCIOUS. I'm a DJ and designer whose work often focuses on the queer club scene and inclusivity in general. And today I am joined by Raver Jinn, or Sonia, who is joining us from New York. Sonia, would you like to introduce kind of a little bit about your practice and what you do?
Yeah, so thanks so much for having me. I'm Sonia. My artist name is Raver Jinn, and I'm a graphic designer, a DJ and producer based between New York and Michigan, mostly in New York. But yeah, also very much centered on the QT Pop rave scenes, yeah, I'm excited to speak with you today.
We're very, very excited to speak with you too. Huge fan of your work. And in terms of your work, what would you say the kind of main inspirations and influences are for it?
I would say I'm definitely really inspired, like aesthetically, by 90s rave aesthetics, of course, but also a lot of just club graphics that come out from like newer events that I will see. Yeah.
Great. I mean, same here. And I didn't really explain this at the start, but one of the main reasons behind this conversation today is, you know, I personally conducted some research into queer rave art. When you look at, you know, the popularity of the rave art from the early 90s and even from the noughties, that are constantly exhibited, celebrated in books, publications, articles, and have gone on to influence generations of designers. But if you ask anybody or look for any kind of examples of archives or discussions on the art from queer spaces, you can't really find anything. And that's what's kind of prompted me to engage in this discussion today, speaking to yourself and Susie Mason in regards to looking at the history, the present, and hopefully the future of queer rave art and being able to kind of contextualize that. So, I mean, you talked about that being one of your influences, but also you also talked about, you know, the cutie pop scene as well. How exactly do you feel like that disseminates into your artwork? Like, is there any specific characteristics or things that you kind of like consider from both scenes, to be honest, that you feel actually then, how does that reflect into the work that you produce?
Yeah. Oh, big time. I feel like kind of the queer rave scene and my art practice, the art practice of a lot of designers in New York are like deeply entwined and symbiotic and kind of rely on each other in really big ways. Like, I think when I moved to New York pre-pandemic, the queer rave scene was so vast and I hadn't experienced that elsewhere. And I was really grateful to receive like a high volume of commissions. And without that, I think without that, I wouldn't have been able to hone my design sense in the same way. And I think, it's does feel very symbiotic. Like, it's really incredible being able to design graphics for some of these collectives, and be able to help funnel people to like the beautiful spaces that they're curating.
Yeah, I really feel that too. Having worked with quite a few queer collectors and things like that, and it's definitely an ambition for my own work. You know, you talked about kind of being able to funnel people into these spaces. How do you go about communicating with a queer audience through your art? Like, is there any specific kind of like things that you have to think about when wanting to communicate a poster with a queer audience rather than with a, you know, cis straight audience?
That is really interesting. I feel like most of the rave flyers that I've been able to do have been for a queer audience, which I've been really grateful for. I do notice sometimes like different like themes or norms in design for like, I guess, cishet straight centered events versus like QT-POC centered events. And I feel like with the former, it can sometimes just be a lot more commercial. And with the latter, like across the board, I see it in other designers' work a lot. It just seems like more experimental, like referencing a lot of the like 90s club aesthetics as well. So it's kind of like, even if it isn't explicitly stated, there's like a visual language that maybe draws people in, or people like recognize, okay, this is a space that, or sometimes it's explicitly stated on the flyer as well. Like, oh, you know, this, people know, okay, this is a trans DJ collective or whatever. But I think sometimes the design can assist in curating the kind of audience, or like drawing in a specific audience. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you know, I definitely agree. And in terms of like your own kind of more personal work, do you feel like your gender identity and sexuality and queerness play into that as well in any specific ways?
I think so. Yeah, I feel like being queer and non-binary, oftentimes the connections and relationships between my collaborators are deeply personal. Like they're my very close friends, and I feel like it makes the designing process. There's a lot more trust, and let me think. I think also there's a lot of similarities in the ways I'm like evolving my own gender presentation and kind of like digital selves, and then also evolving my design practice and like experimenting kind of in tandem. And it feels like I'm creating this like little mythology or reality of like this Raver Jinn character who's kind of like this ghost of the club scene or something. Yeah, but it all feels like kind of part of one world and very related.
Well, yeah, that's really interesting that you described it like that, because that is something that I also experience, but I've never spoke to anybody or read anybody that does the same. Like I very much I'm curating a character in kind of the way that I present not just like my own work, but kind of the way that I present myself digitally, and it all kind of falls under like similar kind of like stories that I'm trying to tell. Do you find that like storytelling plays a part in your work a lot, or?
Ooh, yeah, I think more so since I've started branching into merch design. I think especially the pandemic forced a lot of designers to pivot to like other forms of design, since a lot of event spaces were completely wiped out. But yeah, especially with merch design as well, I've gotten to do more research and have more kind of like narrative work on garments, whether that's like poetry or kind of like a collective's mission statement, or storytelling through imagery that I'm curating onto that. And I think that's definitely going to like affect my design practice moving forward too, regardless of the medium. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And you mentioned merch, but your practice incorporates quite a few different mediums, right?
Yeah, I feel like I'm cycling. I always am cycling through different mediums. But for a while I was working on flyer design, and then pivoted to merch design, and then was doing jewelry design a little bit because I was like too many of my mediums are very logged on. I need to do something like offline. Yeah, those are kind of the main three.
Do you find that you often are like considering inclusivity and like queerness in these other mediums as well? And if so, are there any differences in those approaches to that than the same way that you'd think about a rave flyer?
About a what? I'm sorry?
About a rave flyer.
Okay. I think in terms of inclusivity, at least with merch design, one thing that I kind of realized, and I think a lot of other designers are realizing, is that merch can be a really useful tool for like wealth redistribution back into like queer spaces or queer collectives, trans collectives. So that's been really cool to kind of like grow that part of my practice, and then help funnel money back into these communities. I think in terms of accessibility. One thing that I've been learning with flyers too, it was brought to my attention as well, that it can be really helpful to make like multiple versions of a graphic too, and make sure things are really legible, especially if you have a more like complex design style, or things might not always be legible to everyone. So I feel like I'm always learning about access and inclusivity, and like how I can improve that within my design practice.
Yeah, I see what you mean. I think that, you know, merchandise and using that to redistribute wealth is a great and fun way to go about that. And accessibility, yeah, a lot of people don't really consider that or think about people who, you know, might not be able to, might be colorblind, or, you know, may kind of have like reading difficulties or learning difficulties, and how they'd be able to access the same kind of information that we would. And my own research has shown, you know, it's even in things such as like signposting in venues, and kind of like, you know, lighting in venues as well. There's so many things that are often unconsidered, can often be exclusive of people in spaces that are intending to be inclusive, you know. And kind of talking more about wider inclusivity in the queer scene, I understand that you run the platform at BIPOC Design, BIPOC.design, sorry. Maybe you could tell us kind of a little bit about that, and like what you've learned from that experience on, you know, how to create an effective platform for minorities.
So I think that platform I started it out of frustration with kind of a lot of the designers behind these posters being obscured sometimes. They're not even credited, so you don't even know who's designing them a lot of the time, or like white cishet designers getting a much higher volume of commissions than a lot of like equally talented Black and non-white queer trans designers as well. I think with that, I learned that it is really important to always like tag and credit designers for their work so that they can be getting more commissions. I think one challenge with curating that platform was just like limitations of Instagram. Like it can be hard to properly archive everyone's work and make it easily accessible, make all their contact information easily accessible, and ensure artists are getting paid opportunities and not just like exposure. I think another thing too, which is important for that platform, but also in so many spaces, is like being mindful of who the audience is and not like outing folks or like pigeonholing them. Like, for example, if someone is a trans designer, they might not want it advertised online that they are a trans designer, depending on like who the audience is. So I think it's important for me and for everyone to just be like mindful of these things.
I 100% agree. So moving on to kind of like the New York scene and the US scene, you know, obviously I'm from England. I've got not much of an idea what kind of things are like over there compared to in the UK. Obviously your work is fantastic, but do you feel like there are a lot of other people who are kind of championing inclusivity, and did you feel like there are actually a lot of other people doing other things similar to you in your scene, or is there a lot of room for your scene to grow?
I think it's kind of like both at the same time. Like the New York scene seems very much like an ecosystem where folks and collectives will kind of like step up when others maybe don't have capacity. And I felt that as well, where there are times where I feel really burnt out and I'll refer people to like my close friends who are designers as well. And let me see. I do think there's room for the scene to grow. There's always room for people to be like trusting and investing in like new designers, specifically seeking out like Black and non-white queer and trans designers too. Yeah, so definitely room for growth, but also, yeah, the scene is like very fast at the same time.
That's great, and that's great that there's a sense of family by the sounds of it, and a support system in each other. Do you feel like that art and design and creativity play quite an active role in your scene? I mean, outside of flyers, you know, just creativity, kind of like, are there any ways in which these collectives and platforms like allow creativity and self-expression to like shine in their spaces?
Yeah, I really think so. I feel like the club scenes are kind of just like a locus for so many kinds of creativity, like bringing people together, whether that's like through photography or design. I noticed that club spaces are really important for people to be able to experiment with like affirming looks, affirming kinds of presentation too for themselves. Also like supporting clothing designers that they might like, or like making their own clothing. I think also photography is kind of like symbiotic with the rave scenes in the same way that flyer design is as well. But yeah, I think the club scenes are like such a big locus for like experimentation and creativity for sure.
Amazing. And are there any kind of like trends or like commonalities that you see in the kind of flyers of the New York kind of queer club scene? Like, you know, you mentioned your own work being experimental. Is that something that kind of is across the scene as a whole? And like, for example, in the UK, quite a huge trend is, you know, playing with this idea of parody, especially around pop culture, you know, taking pop culture references and playing on them, you know, and taking like logos from other kind of, from other like well-known brands, and like flipping them and changing them around to be like a little bit naughty or tongue-in-cheek. Does that happen a lot in your scene, and there's any kind of similar trends like that?
Yeah, I feel like I'll see that sometimes. Well, I guess this is still UK based, or it's kind of UK US based, but are you familiar with Manara, the DJ and producer based in the UK?
Actually, I don't think so.
So Manara released it was called a Spice Mix on Bandcamp, and it was, if I remember correctly, I think maybe like multiple, or I don't know if it was all Manara's work, but basically it was like a cover of like a spice packet that this designer based here in New York, their handle's ahmad.png, I believe, made, and it was basically like this little South Asian, maybe Indian spice mix, but it was like photoshopped to have the artist's like album art on it. Yeah, I feel like I'll definitely see like also people using memes for their Bandcamp releases, like things like that. I think other visual themes that I see, yeah, definitely like so many visual references to like 90s rave graphics, or like different cover art, or sometimes even like collaging that directly into a flyer. So it seems like kind of like part of a single lineage, which is really beautiful. Yeah. And I'm sure there's a lot of like references that bounce too between like UK design and design in New York as well. Mm-hmm.
You know, I agree with that. So obviously, you know, that the same kind of motivations and behind these spaces, and there's a lot of the same music and overlap there. Are there any particular events or platforms in New York that you think are kind of real shining examples of, you know, playing with art and creativity in their spaces to facilitate queerness?
Yeah, I think collectives that I really look up to that do all of that as well. Disc Cakes would be a big one. They're so incredible. And I really like that they're deeply committed to like safety and harm reduction. Like even outside of the rave events, they did like a Narcan overdose training recently. Who else can I think of? There is a publishing house called Objectify. It's spelled object, I think, defy, but it's like pronounced Objectify, I think. And it is a Black trans run publishing house. And I think they have some events or like we'll do live stream fundraisers, which is really sick. And it's cool that the money is getting funneled into like a publishing house, Black trans run publishing house. There's another one that I can think of. They aren't New York based, they're DC based. Post-binary, I used to organize with them like a little over a year ago. But yeah, they're a DC based music platform, uplifting Black, trans, non-binary and intersex cultural workers and musicians. And they have done a lot of work in terms of like redistributing gear and money and resources to those communities as well. Yeah, in the music scene. Yeah.
A question that I recognize I probably should ask you a bit earlier was what is your kind of process when it comes to creating a rave flyer? Is there anything in it that differs? I mean, you talked about kind of like how the end products often differ when you're looking at you know, cis spaces and queer spaces, but do you find anything in the process differs, or and generally, yeah, just what is your process to create such amazing work?
Thank you. Let's see. I think my process has kind of evolved even a little bit, like during the pandemic as well. Since my mediums are kind of evolving. Definitely when I first started out, my process was just to like experiment with font and textures for like hours on end. And I think I would like compile visual references too on Pinterest, which weirdly like has a pretty solid archive of flyers, but unfortunately they aren't always, the artist isn't always credited.
Very true.
Yeah. But I think for a while I was like compiling visual references. Also, I would like ask whoever I'm designing for what kind of like the mood or the theme of the event would be, or like what they're trying to like evoke, and try to reflect that in the design. So there's some maybe flyers that where they would tell me, okay, the music is going to be like upbeat, happy techno, and like the colors are very vibrant. And then there's another one where the person I was collaborating with wanted it was around Halloween, and I think they wanted the event to be like referencing ghosts and like the supernatural, and the colors were a bit more like muted and kind of like haunting. Yeah, so I try to reflect that in the design.
Wicked. Yeah. And so kind of, I think we've got a few minutes kind of left in terms of that half an hour mark. So kind of looking at like the future of rave design, or of queer rave design, how do you think we as designers could be going about making our design more inclusive? And what tips would you have for any promoters themselves to kind of be more inclusive with how they interact with their queer designers?
That is a great question. I feel like as designers, like reminder to myself and of course all the other designers, is to just listen to any access concerns that come up with like legibility of flyers. Also, sometimes as designers, you can suggest things to the people running the event, the promoters. You can suggest like, oh, do you want or access information on the flyer, like how accessible the building is, or whether the event is free, or all these other things, like things as designers too, you kind of like, you're contributing to the space as much as, or not as much as, but as well as the promoter. So yeah, designers should definitely feel empowered to suggest things to add to the flyer. I think on the promoter side, and I guess like everyone who's involved in curating a space, there's so many things we can do. I think I hadn't time to reflect on this in the pandemic, but I was just thinking like it'd be cool if there was more seating at events, if there's definitely like water, food, non-alcoholic drink options. I think there's opportunities to partner with like local vendors or have intergenerational partnerships too, so that rave spaces are like supporting the local community in more ways. And I think especially in New York, like mutual aid really boomed in the pandemic. And I think there's ways for designers and promoters and folks involved in mutual aid to like come together in really beautiful ways.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess maybe some other things too, having like consent forms, harm reduction resources as well, which some collectives are already doing. What else? Safe ride systems, which I've seen collectives doing as well, to like make sure folks get home safe, especially queer and trans folks. Oh yeah, and one big thing I can think about is like more transparency around safety and payment, in terms of like venues paying Black and brown and queer and trans musicians, and same goes for like designers as well, like more transparency around rates and all of that. But yeah, so many ways for us to grow.
A lot. I'm sure a lot more. But there was some fantastic advice for all you promoters listening out there. If anyone, I think that is all the time that we have. So yeah, thank you so much for this, Sonia. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you.
If anyone that is watching and listening wants to kind of find out more about your work, is there anywhere that they can go? Or
Yeah. So I have probably most of my work on Instagram, unfortunately, but my handle is at raver.jinn, and I have a website as well, jinnlab.club. The link to BIPOC design is in my Instagram account as well. It's just at BIPOC dot design. So many other designers there that folks can commission. And then I have a small but growing Bandcamp that is Raver Jinn at bandcamp.com. But yeah, Instagram's probably best.
Great. Well, yeah, everybody, make sure you go and check out Sonia's amazing work. And thank you for anyone that has tuned in and listened and watched these conversations today. I hope you've learned a lot. I hope that you've found out something new, and I hope that these conversations can hopefully inspire some more change and growth and celebration of queer rave art. Come on, it needs to be done.
Yeah.